Hello, I'm Ian, and this is Somerset News Network. Reform in Civil War. Over a burqa? Who would have thought it? You can't make this up. The chairman, allegations got Rupert Lowe suspended and sacked from the party. Nothing founded. There's been no report. The King's Council that was set up never gave a report. The word on the grapevine is that she didn't like the way that the party was reporting to the press before she'd made her findings. So she said bye-bye. So there's no reports. So Rupert Lowe is still innocent. But he's been thrown out of the party that he agrees with, and we agree with. That's why I withdrew my support from reform. But Sarah, the new MP for Runcorn, stands up at parliamentary question time and says, as the Prime Minister is aligning himself more with Europe, will he align himself with France and other European countries and ban the burqa? He didn't answer the question. He didn't say a thing. He said, well, Nigel Farage's finance plan is never going to work. So he never answered the question about what he's going to do about the burqa. It was spot on. You know, and I was thinking, well done, girl, I like you. But that set off a chain of events. Now, was it set up to upset the chairman, who just happens to be a Muslim? Was it a setup for him? Or was it a setup for Starmer? Well, I think it does both things. I think it showed Starmer for what he is because he won't answer a question, and it shows the chairman up for trying to run the party behind the scenes. There was a press release from Reform, which I think came from the chairman, which would have been from head office, that banning the burqa is not a policy of Reform. We're told through the grapevine on the press, the people that are in the know, that Farage and the chairman had a blazing row. And the chairman wrote on his X feed that he's resigned. Couldn't happen to a nicer bloke. You know, yeah, he seemed a good bloke. But when he had a go at Rupert, with allegations that can't be proven, that's what I didn't like. And if they're going to act on any rumour that's going, what's Reform going to be like if they get into government? They've got to have some responsibility on what they do. There's got to be some sort of decorum, as they say. Will Rupert Lowe come back into Reform? What about Ben Habib? Maybe. He used to be the chairman. You know, then we got Evans, the one that wrote the manifesto, that one I didn't like, one very good. You know, how many of those ex-UKIP and Brexit members could come back into the fold now? I've said before on this channel that there ought to be like an agreement, a memorandum of understanding of people who aren't in the major parties. The Lib Land Com party. We can put the Liberal Democrats in there because they were with the Conservatives in government. You know, and in the last election they said you can't put a fag packet between them. There's no division of ideas or powers or anything. Sunak was more Labour than Labour when he was in number 10. And now Starmer's in, he's Labour on steroids. Reform can make a lot of gains, but they've got to sort themselves out. They're going to get people like me back in. They're going to get people like me to trust them. Because I like reform. I believe in reform policies. But they're a bit wishy-washy. We want a set of rules, set of ideas, that if reform take the government, which they could do, or they might go into coalition, say, with the Conservatives to hold power, or with the Irish parties, maybe. Don't know. But I think that they need a proper manifesto with everything laid out. On defence, home security, crime, schools, councils, NHS, social security and pensions. Boom, 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 boom. And lay out how they would keep it running if it's a good idea and it's working, or how they would reform it to make it better. That's what you're supposed to do. We know they want to stay out of Europe. That's said. That's what they're there for originally. So that's one thing. They're Brexiteers. That's without saying. They want to look after the borders. They don't want the boat people coming in. That's okay. Now, there's a mixed message now about what they're going to do with the migrants that have already come over on the boats. They're here illegally. Some say they want them deported. Some say they want them to stay. And reform's got to sort that one out. I suspect that the chairman that's just resigned was for letting them stay. And people like Farage and Lee Anderson, and definitely Rupert Lowe, because he said it, wants them to go back home. It's quite simple. They are here illegally. We shouldn't be housing them, feeding them, or anything. You know, they say, oh, we'll put them up in tents. Yeah, fair enough. But we ought to give them a choice. Either they get house arrest in a hotel, or they go back home, but they're getting no money. Because they're then profiting off their crimes. So that's a no-brainer. But there's so many of them here now. The police are worried about trying to control them. People that confront them where they've got these little tented villages in towns are being chased off when people are saying you can't live here. Locals don't want to. And they're all illegal migrants. Now, because they're not in hotels, I don't think they've come through the system. I think they've come over in boats and just vanished. I suspect that they're working with crime. I expect they're working cash in hand. You know, we've got to clean up. And, you know, we just can't allow it to happen. It's going to destroy this country. On pensions, reform should be saying we want the winter furlough allowance brought back in, and we'll put red line on it that it can't be removed. That would be a good move. On farmers, I think Farage has already said that he's going to scrap the inheritance tax on farmers and put it back to what it was. For the big farms, not the little farms. You know, the average small farm is round about 100 acres. And we had 7 small farms in my village. All of 7 of them, if the farmer dies, they're going to have to pay this inheritance tax. The people aren't rich. They haven't got lots of money. If they're milking cows, they're losing money, and they've got to do other. They're running 2 or 3 other businesses. Wife's got a business. The husband's got a business. On top of milking the cows, and you've got to milk cows 7 days a week. I was involved in farming since the age of 7. I used to have to go across the fields. We had woods at the back of us, and then the small farm that I used to help out on, and then hop over the edge and go in the farm that I used to work on. And my job was to get the cows in and take them back out, and feed the cows the cattle cake when they're being milked. As time went on, when I was 13, 14, I was then helping to milk the cows. You know, I don't think I did a lot, but I was there. I saw how it worked. You'd let a cow would finish milking, you'd let it out, the door would open, and you'd let another one in. That was my job. You know, farming is not a 9 till 5 job. You don't get 5 weeks holiday. And you're very lucky if you can earn enough money to get a pension. The land is asset rich. Farmhouse on its own. Old stone farmhouse. One of the farms where I go, the farmhouse was built in the Middle Ages, the original part of the house, and it was called a Somerset Longhouse, where they used to house the bachelors before they got married, and they would be working on the land. And it was called Bachelor's Hall. There's a folk song about it. Sea Span done it. Then it was turned into a farmhouse at different stages around the 1600s. Then it was rebuilt in the 1700s. Then it was upgraded during the Victorian times. The house itself is worth $1 million on its own. And with 100 acres of farmland, it's worth $2 million. Therefore, they get the inheritance tax. But they haven't paid for it. It's been in the family for 5 or 6 generations. You know, we've got to look after our farmers. The farmers feed us. One of the things they say, you don't destroy the hand that feeds you. You know, if we don't look after our farmers, they're not going to produce the food so we can eat. What we ought to do, in my opinion, is go back to the mentality that we had after the war, that every farm produced as much food as it could. But what do? We now do set aside. But we pay the farmers to do set aside for wildlife. So we're producing less, so we got to buy more from abroad. Now we've stopped those farm payments. Labour are going to stop the farm payments. So set aside is going to go, because a farmer ain't going to have land set aside if he's not getting any money for it. He's going to put the crops in to get the money back that he's lost. They're going to destroy the countryside. And Reform have got to put that into their manifesto. Schools. Now we saw it under Blair. School history was like a socialist manifesto. Our kids came home from school with a history book, and it was all socialist stuff. Industrial Revolution, all the unions, how they started, and how they fought the robbing barons or whatever they call them, you know, and it was all the Labour Party and the unions were the good guys, and the guys that gave people jobs and created industry were the bad guys. There were some bad industrialists, I'm not going to argue that, but there was good industrialists as well. You look at the Cadbury family. They were Quakers, weren't they? If I remember correctly. They made good housing. Most terraced houses, but it was good houses for their workers. Because they had a social responsibility. You know, so they all weren't bad. Farms had cottages that the workers were housed in. You know, it ain't all bad. And it ain't all socialist. You know, we were the people that got rid of slavery. I think it was 1833. I do stand corrected. Put a note down below if I'm wrong. We outlawed slavery and we used our Royal Navy to intercept slave ships and free the slaves. That's why we did put the island in the Indian Ocean, was free slaves. So what do? We start ourselves the island back to somebody else. And then we got to rent our ground back. Reform should be saying, hey, this is wrong, we can't do this. And it all ought to be in the manifesto. Pension funds. Do you know we got a two-tier pension fund? Not because of Labour, because it happened under the Conservatives. Me and my wife are pensioners. I get one price, my wife gets another price. Now, I get about £800 a month state pension. My wife only gets 600 and something pounds pension because she's just that little bit older than me. The state pension should be a fixed rate for everybody over the age of 65. And Reform can put that in their manifesto. You know, I'm writing your manifesto for you, Mr. Farage, if you're watching this. You know, it's basic logic, basic common sense policies. We shouldn't be closing down all the post offices. We shouldn't be building on all the green belts. And don't talk to me about net zero. When I worked for the civil service, we had the science magazines and other magazines come through our hands, and they'd put your names on a piece of paper at the top, and it would go around the offices. My name was on the bottom. Well, mostly I saw it about 2 months after it had come into the office. But there was information in there that said that oil was not a fossil fuel. Coal is a fossil fuel, but gas and oil are not fossil fuels. What happened was, in Texas, the oil wells, you know, the nodding donkeys that they had, they went dry. And somebody bought these nodding donkeys and wanted to see how much was left. They found that the oil had come back. And they said, well, how can this be? If it's a fossil fuel, it shouldn't be there, because it's run dry. And the scientists got involved, and they found that the oil is produced by decaying bacteria in the rocks. Yeah. The gas and the oil is decaying bacteria in the rocks. So it replenishes itself. Now, we could be using more than it's replenishing by, and that's why they run dry. But they fill back up again. So that's going to happen in the North Sea. They've closed oil wells in the North Sea because they're not profitable when they've run out. But in time, that oil will come back and we can drill it. You see, that's another policy that can be put in the referendum, the policy document. You know, there's all sorts of things. And global warming is a scam. It's an absolute lie. It's the biggest lie on humanity since COVID. COVID was man-made. I had a scientific paper. I did the research and I found a scientific paper, and the scientific paper had parts of HIV spliced into COVID. They didn't find that out for 2 years until end of 2021-22, when they found it in South Africa, and it was only mentioned once at 5:30 on the BBC on the World Service. Never said again. So COVID had HIV on it. That's why everybody's that's had COVID is now having problems. And it's something to do with spike proteins. But that can also be talked about in our document, in our manifesto. There are lots of things we can do. Carbon dioxide is not a greenhouse gas. Before the dinosaurs, we're talking 600,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago. 500 million years ago. The Earth erupted. There was lots of volcanic activity, and it did produce a lot of CO2 and acid rain, and almost wiped out the life on Earth. But some stayed on. But CO2 is not the all end all, because of the amount. It was something like 5,000 parts per million. When the dinosaurs are around, 250 million years ago, the CO2 level was 4,200 parts per million. That's why you had big trees and they produced the coal. And they produced big dinosaurs. Ever since, that CO2 level has been falling. We're now round about 300 parts per million. And they want to go on net zero and get rid of carbon. Carbon produces plants. We're carbon life forms. If you reduce the CO2, you reduce the amount of food you can grow. How crazy can you get? CO2 is not a problem. If CO2 was going up to 500, to 1,000, then I'd say, hang on a minute, do we need to cut it or not? But it isn't, it's falling still. But it's not causing the greenhouse gases. Clouds are responsible for warming or cooling the Earth. If there's less clouds, then the sun comes through and it warms up. It's basic logic. So no matter how much CO2 produced, that ain't going to make a bit of difference. Ed Miliband's talking about cutting out the sun for global cooling because we got global warming. How crazy can you get? If you cut out the sun over the oceans, then the water vapor doesn't heat up and you don't get clouds, therefore it's going to make it hotter. You need the sun on the sea to produce the water, to produce the steam, to produce the cloud, produce the rain that produces the water. You know, it's basic, logic. Put it all in the manifesto. Crime is another thing. We all have to stop crime. And the paedophile gangs is one thing that we got to tackle. The police, because they're an ethnic minority group, don't want to upset them, so they don't do anything. Somebody's got to turn around and say, I don't care what religion they are, I don't care the colour of their skin, they're paedophiles. They're gang raping girls. And it's got to stop, and we got to do what we can. And everybody has got to be a part of the clean up. Tommy's been put in jail to try and shut him up. Because that's how he started, was complaining about the grooming gangs. You know, bring them all in the fold for this memorandum of understanding. And then reform may not be standing in a constituency, but someone who agrees with reform. You've got UKIP is still out there, and now you've got the Great British, I don't quite know what Ben Habib calls it, but there's like a coalition he's trying to get together. Well, they've got to get together with reform. And everybody's got to be on the same playbook. And if they gain MPs, then we can form a government. It's not rocket science. We've got to stop the civil war in reform. We've got to get back to basics. And reform has got to get people like me to say, right, I'm back on board. Because I agree with you. But the way you've treated Rupert Lowe, I've got to back off. Because I don't agree with what you did. Anyway, Ian, I've talked for long enough. I rabbit on like this for hours if you want. You know, I could do another hour, but I'm not going to. It's for another day. Anyway, bye-bye, everybody.